So this is the Dutch Plus complete test with cortisol awakening response. This is my go-to test when it comes to assessing hormones, both adrenal hormones and sex hormones. So I'll just quickly take you through this test to show you a little bit about what it's about and what makes this unique in comparison to a lot of other tests that look at hormones and adrenal function in general. The first section of this test is kind of an overview again of the entire test. And this is both for men and for women, but I'm going to really highlight this test because it is for females and it really helps us assess risk factors when it comes to breast cancer and hormone related cancers specifically. But the first section of this test is looking at overall hormone production, estrogen, both estradiol. It also tells us about estrone, which is the more inflammatory estrogen, and estriol, which is another estrogen mainly produced when women are pregnant. It looks at progesterone, it looks at testosterone, it looks at DHEA, and then it looks at cortisol. Now, a cortisol comes in many forms. It tells us a little bit about free cortisol, what's available for the cells to use, and what's actually coming out of the adrenal gland, which is reflected by the metabolized cortisol or cortisol metabolites. A lot of people who are familiar with adrenal testing recognize the importance of looking at the adrenal glands throughout the day to make sure that cortisol levels rise when they're supposed to rise and then drop when they're supposed to drop. And again, this is looking at your cortisol pattern or your circadian rhythm. Now, one of the unique things about this test is it looks at that awakening response, which tells us a lot about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis or HPA axis. And then again, it tells us where things are happening throughout the day. So a lot of people who are wired and tired, they're amped up and anxious, but they're exhausted all the time. Their levels will be super high. And then there's other people who are just completely in the pits where they have no energy and their levels will be super low. This tells us a little bit about problems with insomnia. A lot of times people with insomnia have issues with cortisol or being high in the middle of the night, and this test evaluates for that. And there's certain treatments that we can implement and supplements we can implement to help generate balance again. But again, this first page just gives us an overview on what's going on with the adrenal gland and what's going on with the hormones. Now, it gets into much more detail as the test progresses. This section is starting off looking at progesterone metabolites and estrogen metabolites. Now, these estrogen metabolites are absolutely important. In fact, I think most women should be assessing these at some point to see if they're breaking down their estrogen into the healthy metabolites or into the inflammatory metabolites that cause oxidative stress, cell damage, and can increase your risk for breast cancers. So, and if that is happening, there are things that we can do and supplements we can intervene with to help metabolize estrogens or hormones more efficiently and more safely. So you can see here we're looking at estrone, like I mentioned before, estradiol, estriol, which is the pregnancy hormone, and then we're looking at all of these metabolites. Are we pushing estrogens into the 2-hydroxy or the 4 or 16-hydroxy, which are more of the problematic metabolites. So we don't want 4 and 16. And if people aren't methylating or detoxifying appropriately, these are things that we need to assess and correct so we don't run into problems with some of those inflammatory conditions down the road. It also tells us about androgens. Now, DHEA is very important for energy, for cholesterol metabolism. It's important for cognition and bone health, just like testosterone as well. Even women are supposed to have testosterone, and when they don't, they typically will have poor cognitive function. They'll have low energy. They'll have fatigue. They'll have low sex drive. And all of these things are absolutely important for maintaining optimal health overall. So we want to assess these and make sure these are where they need to be. A lot of people with adrenal fatigue have low testosterone, which leads to low muscle mass. And again, increases risk for problems with bones and other issues that we worry about typically a little later on in life. So getting a very clear and, overview of where the hormones are at are absolutely essential. Now, this doesn't mean that if your hormones are low, you need to replace your hormones. In some situations, we do that, but we want to be thinking about how do we get these things up naturally and why are the hormones low? And this is a good little analysis to help us figure that out. A lot of people have low hormones because they are stressed out or they have adrenal fatigue. Now, your body knows that you need cortisol to maintain wellness and to stay alive, but you don't need sex hormones. Now, the thing that a lot of people don't know is that cortisol, or your main adrenal hormone, and your sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen, are derived from the same place, which is from cholesterol. So your body takes cholesterol and converts it into pregnenolone, which you're seeing up here. And pregnenolone is the mother hormone that gives birth to a lot of these other hormones. So if your adrenals are worn out and you're burning through cortisol, your brain is going to say, hey, forget these sex hormones. We need to use all that fuel to make cortisol to stay alive. And that's exactly what happens, which leads to depleted sex hormones and all of the problems that goes along with that. Hot flashes, night sweats, insomnia, vaginal dryness, low libido. These things are really troublesome. But again, beyond replacing those hormones, we want to figure out what's driving the adrenals to be so out of whack so we can bring balance back into the equation. So we can take that pregnenolone and convert it into appropriate amounts of cortisol, but also appropriate amounts of these sex hormones. Down here, we're looking more at how estrone is being metabolized. Estrone is one of the more inflammatory estrogens. And like I mentioned before, it can go down the pathway to the 2-hydroxy and then get methylated out into 2-methyl-hydroxy. Or it can go down these other two more problematic pathways, 16 or 4-hydroxy. And if you're going down these 16 or 4-hydroxy pathways, that is what can lead to DNA damage and oxidative stress, which then can increase your risk for things like breast cancer. So this is an important test for women. We don't always do it right off the bat, but it's something I always recommend doing at some point, depending on the scenario, because it can help assess, again, risk factors for some of these problematic conditions like breast cancer. So hormones are absolutely essential. Adrenal function is absolutely essential, but beyond correcting or replacing hormones, we have to figure out why they're out of whack to begin with. We have to get to that root cause, and this test gives us some ideas on how to do that. So again, in the later section of this test, we're seeing it break down the individual cortisol levels, it telling us, where you are in the spectrum, if you're on the high end, if you're on the low end, and when your levels are abnormal. And then it gives us a little overview again of, how these hormones all work together from the brain standpoint down to the adrenal standpoint. It's all one big loop. And this test lays it all out there so it is easier to understand. Now, another thing, this is a newer addition to this test. It also tells us a little bit about some nutritional markers, looking at metabolites for B12 and B6, tells us a little bit about glutathione production. And it also looks at some of these neurotransmitters that we're going to pick up on the OAT test: dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin production, and then melatonin. So again, a lot of people jump on melatonin when they have issues with sleep, but this actually tells us, do you need melatonin? Is this a problem for you, or is it something else? And then oxidative stress, which again can increase your risk for cancers, inflammation, heart disease, autoimmunity, and a whole host of other problematic conditions. So this is the Dutch complete test with the cortisol awakening response. Very good test to get an overall overview of where your sex hormones and adrenal hormones are at.